Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we are going to be diving deep into a topic that I think has been on a lot of people's minds over the last few years. It's the Great Resignation, that mass exodus of employees from their jobs starting back in early 2021, primarily in the U.S. And what's really interesting about this is that it happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, like right in the thick of it. And that's the time when you would think people would be like, clinging to their jobs for dear life. You know what I mean? But nope, not what happened. So that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, like what was really going on here. So we are going to be using excerpts from the Wikipedia article on the Great Resignation to try to figure this whole thing out. And joining me today is an expert on this. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to dig into this. It's a really, really interesting topic. To really appreciate how weird this trend was, we kind of have to rewind a little bit, back to the pre-pandemic world. So typically quit rates, the percentage of employees who are voluntarily leaving their jobs, those rates usually kind of follow the economy. If the economy is doing really well, quit rates go up because people are more confident about finding a new job. And then if the economy is doing bad, quit rates go down because people are, a little more scared to leave their current job.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then when the pandemic hit and unemployment went through the roof, you'd think quit rates would just totally plummet, right?
Exactly. And at first they did. In those first few months of 2020, the quit rate in the U.S. actually hit a 7-year low. But
Right.
then things got really, really interesting. Instead of, hunkering down and staying put, people started quitting their jobs in huge numbers. By 2021, we saw a record 47 million Americans leave their jobs.
47 million. Whoa. That's
Yeah.
that's not just a few people here and there. That's like a whole movement. So what was the deal? Was it just pandemic fatigue? Like everyone was just burned out?
Well, it was definitely more than just fatigue. It was really a perfect storm of different factors. And the pandemic was definitely, a catalyst. It sped everything up. And I think one of the biggest factors was this sudden shift to remote work. For a lot of people, it was their first time experiencing that kind of flexibility and freedom.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I remember thinking, wait, I can actually get work done in my pajamas.
Yeah.
It was kind of wild.
Yeah, totally. And once people got a taste of that, it was hard to go back to the old way of doing things, especially for younger generations like millennials and Gen Z. They really value things like work-life balance and flexibility, and they kind of saw the pandemic as an opportunity to reset their relationship with work.
Yeah, it's like the pandemic forced everyone to step back and think about what they really wanted. And for a lot of people, that traditional 9-to-5 office job just didn't cut it anymore.
Exactly. And on top of all that, there was the huge problem of burnout, especially in industries like healthcare and hospitality. These are the people who are already dealing with a ton of stress and long hours even before the pandemic.
Yeah, I can only imagine what it was like for those frontline workers during that time. It's not surprising that so many of them just reached their breaking point.
Yeah. It was tough. There was actually a survey done by the Royal College of Nursing, and they found that over a third of nurses were considering leaving the profession because of burnout and stress. And it wasn't just because of the pandemic itself. It was more like the pandemic kind of brought all these systemic issues to the surface.
Right, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back.
Exactly. And it's interesting because while burnout was kind of pushing people out of their jobs, there was also this pull towards something more meaningful. People were looking for something different. And Microsoft's Work Trend Index found that a lot of the people who quit during this time, they were actually looking for work that aligned with their values or offered better growth opportunities or just gave them a greater sense of purpose.
Like everyone went through this collective existential crisis.
Yeah.
Is this really what I want to be doing with my life?
Yeah, totally. And for a lot of people, the answer was no. They weren't willing to settle anymore. So in a way, the Great Resignation was this search for meaning and fulfillment in this world that had been totally turned upside down.
So we've got this mix of burnout pushing people out and this desire for something more pulling them in.
Right.
And then on top of all that, there were the financial factors too.
Yeah.
Like those stimulus payments and unemployment benefits. That gave some people the breathing room to actually quit and explore new things.
Yeah, definitely. Though it's important to remember that not everyone had that luxury. Some people had to keep working no matter what.
Right, of course. So it really was this complex combination of factors all coming together at this really unique moment in history. But it wasn't just about individual people making career choices right. this mass exodus had to have some bigger impact on the economy as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. It was a huge shift. It
Yeah.
really was. Yeah, like you said, it wasn't just a personal thing, it was a societal thing. Millions of people leaving the workforce all at once. It was bound to have some pretty big consequences.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Like, what happened when all those people quit?
Well, think about it. You've got millions of people suddenly leaving their jobs, especially in industries like, restaurants, hotels, healthcare.
But those jobs that can't be done remotely.
Exactly. So businesses were left in a really tough spot.
It's like the tables turned all of a sudden. Instead of employers having all the power, it was the workers who were calling the shots.
Exactly. Workers were in high demand and they knew it. So this gave them a lot more leverage to negotiate, better wages, better benefits, and maybe even more importantly, more flexibility.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we even saw this reflected in like the surge of worker activism during that
Oh,
time.
yeah, absolutely. Like, remember Striketober back in 2021?
Vaguely.
Oh, it was huge. Like, over 100,000 workers across all sorts of industries went on strike or threatened to. They were demanding better pay, safer working conditions, you name it. It really showed that the Great Resignation wasn't just about leaving bad jobs. It was about fighting for better ones.
Wow. So it was like a collective awakening, like workers realizing they had more power than they thought.
Right. And while some businesses responded by, actually improving conditions for their workers, others turned to a different solution: technology.
Oh, interesting. Like what kind of technology?
Well, the Wikipedia article talks about this huge boom in robotics and AI adoption during this time.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you can't find enough humans to do the work, you turn to robots. But doesn't that kind of raise some even bigger questions? Like what happens to all those jobs that can be automated?
That's the million-dollar question for sure. And the Great Resignation really forced us to confront it.
It's like we got a glimpse into this future where robots are doing a lot of the jobs that humans used to do.
Right. And some jobs will definitely disappear,
Yeah.
but new ones will emerge too.
So it's not all doom and gloom then.
Not necessarily. I mean, think about it. The Wikipedia article calls this period the Great Reshuffle, not just the Great Resignation.
Oh, that's a good point.
People weren't just quitting, they were switching careers, starting businesses, redefining their whole relationship with work.
The Great Reshuffle. I like that. It captures that feeling of movement and change.
Yeah, exactly. But let's not pretend it was all sunshine and roses. The article also mentions that some people actually regretted quitting their jobs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some people missed the stability of their old jobs, or they faced unexpected challenges in their new roles, or they just found that the grass is greener mentality didn't really pan out.
Yeah, that's a good reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all solution here. Everyone's situation is different.
Totally.
You know, something else I found really interesting about this whole thing was how the Great Resignation changed the way we talk about work.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like suddenly everyone was quiet quitting or having bare minimum Mondays.
Right. Those terms went viral.
They did. And
Yeah.
it's like they reflected this whole new attitude towards work.
Yeah. People were setting boundaries, prioritizing their well-being, rejecting the whole hustle culture thing.
It was a cultural shift just as much as an economic one.
Absolutely.
It's amazing how one event can change the way we think and talk about something as fundamental as work.
It really is. And speaking of a global perspective, the Great Resignation wasn't just a U.S. thing.
Oh, right. The article mentioned China's Tang Ping movement. What was that all about again?
So Tang Ping means lying flat. And it was this movement among young people in China who were basically disillusioned with the whole rat race. Like they were tired of the pressure to succeed. And the crazy long work hours.
It's like the opposite of the Great Reshuffle.
Yeah, kind of. It shows how cultural factors play a big role in how people respond to these global shifts.
Right. So we've got this global phenomenon, but it's playing out differently in different parts of the world.
Exactly. And even within the U.S., things weren't static. By August 2022, the U.S. workforce had actually bounced back to pre-pandemic levels.
Oh, wow. So people were going back to work, but was it back to business as usual?
Not quite. While the initial frenzy had died down, the impact of the Great Resignation was still being felt. The labor market was still tight. Workers still had bargaining power. Wages were still rising.
It was a whole new ballgame.
Yeah, exactly.
So the Great Resignation kind of reset the expectations for both workers and employers.
I think so. Workers weren't willing to settle for the old ways anymore, and employers had to adapt or risk losing their employees.
Right.
But as time went on, the pendulum started to swing back a bit. By early 2023, quit rates were declining and wage growth was slowing down. The initial wave had passed.
So was that the end of the Great Resignation then? Did things just go back to normal?
Well, Well, not exactly. While the intensity faded, things had fundamentally shifted. The conversation about work-life balance, flexibility, employee well-being, that conversation continued, and workers, especially in certain sectors, still had a lot of leverage.
So it's like the Great Resignation left its mark, even if it wasn't making headlines anymore.
Exactly. And I think one of the most lasting impacts is the acceleration of automation.
Oh, right, like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, those labor shortages during the Great Resignation, they really forced businesses to adopt new technologies much faster than they probably would have otherwise.
And that has huge implications for the future of work.
It does. Like, what types of jobs are going to be in demand? What skills will people need to thrive in this new landscape?
Yeah, those are big questions.
They are. And they're questions that the Great Resignation really forced us to start thinking about.
Yeah, it really does feel like the Great Resignation opened up this whole Pandora's box of questions about the future of work. Like, what are some of the long-term implications that you find most intriguing?
That's a good question. Well, one that really stands out to me is the potential for a more worker-centric economy. The Great Resignation really showed that under the right circumstances, workers have the power to demand better treatment and actually reshape the workplace.
Yeah, it's like they realized they had this collective bargaining chip,
Yeah.
and they weren't afraid to use it.
Exactly. And that could lead to a more equitable distribution of power, like
Right.
workers having more say in company decisions, benefits, maybe even ownership models. Imagine a future where workers are seen as true partners in a company's success, not just cogs in a machine.
Like a pretty amazing idea, a real shift in the power dynamic. But speaking of power dynamics, didn't the pandemic also highlight the inequalities that exist within the workforce?
Oh, absolutely. The Great Resignation wasn't a universal experience. A lot of people, especially those in essential jobs or low-wage roles, they couldn't afford to quit. They had to keep showing up, often at great personal risk.
Right, that's a good point. These big trends don't impact everyone equally.
No, they don't. And as we move forward, it's really important to think about how we create a more inclusive and equitable future of work. One where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, not just those with the privilege to, reshuffle.
Okay, so beyond this potential shift in power, what other long-term effects do you see playing out?
Well, I think the pandemic, coupled with the Great Resignation, really forced us to rethink that traditional 9 to 5 office model, the rise of remote work and flexible schedules. That's probably here to stay.
Yeah, I can't imagine going back to the old way of doing things, but doesn't this shift create new challenges too?
Of course, it raises questions about, how we manage remote teams. How do we maintain company culture? How do we ensure fairness for those who can't work remotely? These are all things we need to figure out.
Right, and then there's the whole issue of automation, which we talked about earlier. It feels like that's going to be a major force shaping the future of work, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, definitely. As AI and robotics keep advancing, they're going to take over more and more tasks that are currently done by humans, and that's going to create both opportunities and challenges.
It's like we're on the verge of this whole new era of work, where we might even need to redefine what work means.
I think you're right. We might need to reconsider traditional concepts of employment, job security, career paths. We might see new types of work emerge, new ways of earning a living, and new skills becoming essential.
It's exciting and kind of scary at the same time.
It is. But one thing's for sure. The Great Resignation wasn't just a blip on the radar. It was a catalyst for change. And its effects are going to be felt for years to come.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Great Resignation, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
I'd say it's this. The future of work isn't set in stone. It's something we actively shape through our choices, our policies, and our collective imagination. The Great Resignation showed us that the old ways aren't the only ways. We have the power to create a future of work that's more equitable, more fulfilling, and more aligned with our values.
That's an awesome message to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.